Judy Kane, I'd like to welcome you to Suicide Undone. It's always a pleasure to welcome new guests and have the opportunity to have new viewpoints. You have written a book called Your Four Truths: How Beliefs Impact Your Life. And as a social worker for many years, I've seen this over and over again, how one's belief system has tremendous impact, both in a positive and negative way. So I'd like to invite you to talk about your book and what interested you in this subject and how did the book come about?
All right. So, yeah, I had been seeing people and helping them change subconscious beliefs for about 10 years before I wrote the book. And over that time, I noticed some things that seemed to be most prevalent among the people I saw. And so I thought the book might be helpful to understand that they got a lot of beliefs that might be limiting them one way or another in their life, and not realize that's what was going on. Because a lot of people don't know, where the subconscious beliefs come from, or how important they are in our daily lives, right? Because that's our default system. It's our lens through which we interpret our worth, other people's behaviors, events. All of those things are based in our subconscious beliefs.
And how powerful is that when that comes into conscious awareness, right? Because often it's subconscious. And I've heard it said before that one of the goals of therapy is to make the unconscious conscious. And in that process, it's empowering. It gives you a sense of control.
It can. And sometimes even if you discover what they are, it can be hard to change them, right? You notice the patterns, you notice that you have the same relationships, even if they're with different people, right? You might get out of one and say, I'm never going to do that again. And then the next one looks very similar, even though it's with someone else. Or things that get you more worried than most people seem to be about the thing, whatever it is. It might be that you feel really freaked out when you have to go pay bills, or you could always feel like you don't know enough, or that there's some shame that you can't even put your finger on, right? You just always feeling less than. So this book was about if your subconscious beliefs, and most of them get there by the time you're 7, and they aren't things that are necessarily taught to us out loud. It's things you pick up just living those first 7 years, right? You're just a little sponge and pick up the messaging and the beliefs of your immediate family and your community, or even one-time events can create subconscious beliefs. But most of the time when I have worked with people, the things that are holding them back have to do with their lack of believing that they're safe. Sorry about the cat. That they're safe, that they are enough, that they're worthy, that they are lovable, and that they're connected to something bigger than themselves. And so, all of those areas present different outcomes in your behavior and how you're feeling. And a lot of times it's a combination of a bunch of those that are creating a situation that makes it uncomfortable for you.
And in your experience, how resistant are people to changing their belief system? Are some people more flexible than other people? And how do you reach the people that might have very rigid belief structures?
Well, I don't try to convince people, right? When they come to see me, they want something to be different. and what I do is help them create subconscious beliefs that support whatever their goals are. So they get to choose what they would rather be experiencing, and we create the beliefs that support that. But I don't go, tell people that they have issues they need to change or beliefs that need to be different. So, if they're coming to me, they already want something to be different.
So it's the approach is very much solution focused.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Yeah. And another, the process I use, it's very fast. You can change any one belief in usually less than 5 minutes, but it's really helpful for people with a history of trauma, because it doesn't matter where the belief came from. So we don't need to talk about what it is or why it's there. We just replace it with something that you would rather be true.
Yeah, and most certainly this life is so full of challenges, right? And sometimes they're very big ones and sometimes they're little ones, but either way, it's really very important in terms of how to approach, whatever challenge you might be facing at any one time. I often like to use this example of, the Olympics. And what happened to Simone Biles, do you remember a few years ago?
Yes.
And I can't personally imagine what type of pressure it might be on a person to know that literally millions of people have eyes on you and you have to perform perfectly. So it was totally understandable when her anxiety became too much to manage. And I think she had dropped out for a while. The interesting thing is when they approached Michael Phelps and they asked him, how do you manage the stress? He says something very interesting. And he said, I like to see it as a challenge to be overcome versus something to shirk away from or retreat from and maybe have a lot of negative thinking behind that. It's two radically different approaches with totally different outcomes, right? Because we know how successful he was. But it's really very enlightening, right? To know that same situation, right? But just two different approaches.
Yes. And I think what you said a little while ago about being solution oriented, I think is key, right? If you focus on the problem instead of a way to solve it, it always feels worse.
Yeah, I think definitely having a sense of control and being inner directed, knowing that you have more control than you might give yourself credit for. And it's, a lot of times people feel helpless and because maybe they haven't met with success or just trying the same thing and it's not working. But often having a different perspective can really radically change the outcome. So what would you say to people who are depressed and who don't see a way out of their problems?
One of the things that I discuss when I start talking with people is, what are you experiencing and what would you rather experience, right? And so often it's surprising that people haven't thought a lot about what they want. They're working so hard to avoid a consequence that they haven't really spent a lot of time thinking about what they would really like to be doing, right? And we aren't encouraged, I don't think, to sit down and what would I like, right? I mean, it's not something that I think is a conversation in most families. It's more like, you need to do this so that you can not have this bad thing happen to you, or you know, there is always a reason for doing the things that's not necessarily because it's something you want. And so I'm always struck by the fact that sometimes people don't know what they would rather be experiencing, right? And so I think one of the first things for people who have a situation that they don't like is to spend a little bit of time and figure out what they really want to be true in their life or in that situation. You know, don't go so big as life, but pick a smaller aspect of life and decide what you would like that aspect to look like. And then think of examples of how it's going to be when that's true for you, right? Immerse yourself in examples of what would it look like if this were true? What would people be saying? What would I be saying to myself? How would I be feeling? So really experience that example as clearly as you can. And I've frequently seen that help change those subconscious beliefs. And it also gives people the path to, you know, they know where they're going then, and they can take steps to move that way.
So that self-knowledge is so critical, right? Because without that, it's kind of directionless.
Or it's not your direction.
That's true.
It could be somebody else's who thought this was a good way for you to go, but it might not be yours.
What can you tell me about resilience skills? You mentioned that before, and there's a type of scoring system, which to me was fascinating because I never heard of it. Tell me a little about the ACEs score.
ACEs score, yes. It's a way of ranking or categorizing the amount of trauma that somebody had in their childhood. And it's the original one was based on 10 questions. And it didn't matter how many times that thing was true. It was either, you know, yes, it happened to me, or no, it didn't. And it was related to different types of abuse at home, whether there was a parent that was in jail, whether there'd been a divorce or a death in the family. So it was traumatic events that happened during childhood. And it was originally done as a study to try to figure out what was causing certain health conditions, chronic health conditions. And they weren't really expecting to see it be related to childhood trauma, but they noticed the patterns in the study. And that was where this whole effort took off from. So that if, you know, the higher your score, 1 through 10, the more trauma, you know, the higher the trauma level has been that you've experienced. And it's hard to make decisions when you're in constant trauma, right? So there are a lot of situations in life that if you aren't making good decisions can come up. You know, you could be more prone to unhealthy relationships or unhealthy behaviors, you know, with substances and that type of a thing. You could be more likely to end up breaking the law. You know, so there are a lot of, and there are also health consequences associated with this as well. But there's also resilience. And so having a high ACE score doesn't necessarily mean that you or you know, there's nothing that can be done, because if there's resilience in your life, that helps counteract the the trauma that's been there. And it's, you know, that's involved where there's, you know, some steady source of support and affection, right? Or, I mean, there are lots of things that can help build resilience, but with a child, that's one of the key ones, is having one person they can count on that cares about them.
I would imagine even in adulthood, right? Just having that anchor can be so important.
Yes.
You know, I work in corrections, and we see many inmates who have these horrible childhoods that are characterized by abuse and neglect. And one thing I always try to impart is the idea that self-care is so important. You may not have had a choice in childhood, but certainly as an adult, what you do in terms of self-care has enormous implications. So, what does self-care look like? When is the avoidance of drugs and alcohol as a way to cope? The avoidance of negative relationships, uh, correcting self-limiting beliefs. It has so many different manifestations.
And being giving yourself some grace, right? That's one way people can start to look at themselves. What are they saying to themselves? What is that self-talk? You know, if it's more of a critic than a cheerleader, try to change that conversation with yourself, right? Because it doesn't help to be telling yourself how awful you are in some aspect of your life. So, you know, and most of the time there's no, if you look at it objectively, like frequently you hear somebody say, I'm such a klutz, right? Because they tripped over something, or they dropped something, or they knocked something over. Well, I mean, that's one time in what, 1,000, 10,000, 40,000. You know, they're not focusing on the fact that they hardly ever trip or knock something over, right? They lock in on that one thing that wasn't the way they wanted it to be and make it bigger.
Yeah, I see examples of negative thinking all the time, both in inmates and also my private practice, people that are professionals. And a lot of times it crops up and they're not even conscious of it.
Mhm.
So one piece of advice I always give people is you almost have to police your thinking. You have to be vigilant of what your thoughts are. And when you get a garbage thought, you put it in the garbage. That's where it belongs. And then pull out a brand new page and write a beautiful thought on it. But there's a lot of things in this life to be negative about, realistically, right? The world's a mess. And often, even in our circles, things can get out of control very quickly. One of the things I always stress to people is there needs to be a counter, right? So we know, for example, in sales, it's a very difficult profession. The more successful people are the ones that are constantly incorporating positive beliefs and affirmations into their work, into their life, and that reflects in productivity. And I say to people, it's very important also because a lot of the tapes that we play are from past negative input, could have been a parent or an ex or whatever the case may be, even a boss. It's important to balance that and to get a steady diet of books, quotes, as a reminder that there's different focus. It doesn't have to be negative. And you know, in my private practice, I've deal with children. I deal with, I think the oldest I've had was 90 years old. And what I really love to do is work with them young, because when you change the thinking young, it could literally save so many years of grief and misery by just, you know, it's the law of attraction. When you put out positive, you're going to get positive.
Right.
You put out negative, the same thing.
Absolutely. It's what you focus on, right? And then you start seeing more of that, whatever it is. And the opposite is true if you've got a scarcity belief about something. If you don't think there's a lot of something out there, you're not going to see it, right?
Yes, yes, absolutely. So I came across this fascinating article. It was in Psychology Today. The author is Monica Johnson, who is a psychologist, and it was entitled 18 Schemas That Changed the Way You See the World. And she identified 8 schemas which the definition of that is a mental framework or mental shortcut that organizes our knowledge and experiences to make sense of the world, to predict outcomes and guide our behaviors. So it's a way of basically categorizing new information. So I think of a lot of these, when you see poor outcomes, it's no wonder, right? Because the schemas are negative. So, for example, emotional deprivation. This schema often arises in adults who had more distant parents who didn't adequately attend to their emotional needs, right? So it's like maybe a void, and there's a heaviness associated with that. A lot of what I see too are the schema that relates to abandonment. So many people have a fear that they're going to lose someone that they have an emotional attachment with. And even when it's a secure relationship, that constant insecurity could actually erode into the quality of that relationship. So it's self-fulfilling prophecy in a way, right?
It is. And I think when you come from, it sounds like the schemas all have a situation in childhood or prior situations anyway, that led to that pattern. Those have beliefs that you get, like before you're 7, if you get abandoned, it's not that somebody's going to say, well, nobody loves you well enough to stick around, right? But that's a story that gets embedded in your subconscious, right? And if you don't think you're worth people sticking around for, you're also more likely to get into a relationship where that's going to happen. So
I think of the psychiatrist and author Gabor Mate. He tells a story of his mother abandoned him in Nazi Germany, not because she didn't love him, but because she wanted to preserve his life. Of course, he was too young to understand that, but that feeling stayed with him through the years. And actually, he is very in tune with the idea that this type of sensation or feeling can cause illness.
yeah. The first place I learned about the impact of the subconscious was I saw somebody help my then husband get rid of a pain that he had, and it was tied to a subconscious belief.
Wow.
And that was when I was like, that's really fascinating. I had no idea. And that was what got me off onto this path to begin with. And I've seen that so often, where there's a physical symptom of the stress that you're experiencing, and your body's trying to get your attention and let you know something needs to change.
Yeah, that mind-body connection is so powerful.
Yeah, it is. Absolutely.
So I just want to, with the schemas, there's so many, and one of them really is about defectiveness and shame, right? And people who are even very successful, often they have this idea of being like the imposter syndrome.
Mm-hmm.
It's basically the belief that they're flawed, and that if others get close, they'll realize this and they'll leave, right? It's so irrational, but for them, it's very real. And another one relates to failure, the belief that they're incapable of excelling or even performing as well as peers. And again, the self-fulfilling prophecy, right? Because you gotta basically have the belief in yourself in order to make it happen. That's part of manifesting.
Yes, absolutely.
What type of audiences do you normally speak to?
Well, I speak to a wide variety because I don't do coaching per se. A lot of times coaches will send a client to me who gets stuck, but I don't do the behaviors or the strategies or the tools. So I don't really need to be niched into like mostly business issues or mostly relationship issues or, because I'm not helping people figure out what they should be doing. I'm there to help change the beliefs so that they're not blocked. So, but frequently it's people either, I have had people come because of physical symptoms of stress. I've had people come for phobias. I've had, because of who I network with, a lot of people come to me to start with because they want to do better with their business. And also when I first started with this, the first coach that she included me in her package, and she was a relationship coach helping people find their true love. So it's been a variety of people that I've seen.
I imagine so many groups of people can benefit from changed belief systems, from business to kids, executives like this. It's just, the field is so wide.
It is. And in my own experience, I've been doing this since 2011, and I haven't gotten to the bottom of my list yet. So it's an endless opportunity for, oh wow, look at that. Let's change that thing because it's getting in my way.
Do you think that, just getting back to resilience skills, do you believe that this is something that can, basically change over time? And even someone who's very like fragile, like what type of circumstances can facilitate the formation of resilience skills?
There are so many ways people can build resilience. You can get out and be in nature, right? You can do things that foster your creativity. There's a lot of the self-care things like meditating or yoga or Tai Chi or Qigong or, any of those things where you get to center and get away from the stressors, right? To kind of get that relief. If you start incorporating things like that and pay attention to when you're feeling stressed out, right? Or when something is not going the way, if you've got those tools, if you've got relationships with people that you can talk with, to share when you've got concerns or just to vent, right? You might not need them for answers, but if they can just listen. It was interesting there. I don't know if you're familiar with the concept of the grandmother bench, but there's and I don't remember the country in Africa, but there's this country, and it was a psychiatrist, and there were very limited numbers of them in the country, but a great need for help with people with problems in their lives that were desperate, really. And they couldn't reach them all. It was literally a handful of psychiatrists in the whole country. And so what he did was he started this, they started training grandmothers in active listening, supportive listening traits. And they spread, they had this training going on so that there were these benches in all the smaller communities where there were women who were trained to just sit there and do active listening. And it made a huge difference on the success rate of people who were battling, serious emotional distress.
Wow, amazing.
Yeah.
I think if modern society with that, people are so focused on their careers And so the children don't necessarily have that, foundation. So that's a wonderful idea that they've done that.
Yeah. Oh, and the perspective of somebody who's lived longer, right? I know with me every year, I appreciate the additional perspective I get. And so talking with somebody who has that broader perspective can be very helpful if you're feeling overwhelmed.
Yes, absolutely. And I see that in therapy a lot of times. Just one comment will just, cause this great revelation, something that they never thought of. Like, we are all in that position. We all can benefit from the perspective or someone's experience. I came across something recently. It's called Happiness Chemicals and How to Get Them. And it's pretty neat. So dopamine, right? That's the reward chemical.
Mm-hmm.
Comes from achieving a goal, getting enough sleep, having a bath, or eating food, right? So much of this is really chemically based. Endorphin, that's the painkiller, exercising. A lot of people forget that could be another tool for feeling better. Actually, my son, who happens to be a social worker, he's very big because he's also trained as a personal trainer. And his practice is based on getting people in and actually incorporating exercise into their therapy. And it's study after study after study shows how effective that is.
Yes.
So as an adjunct to therapy, and something easy enough for anyone to do at home.
Absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely. I mentioned the softer things, but for other people, that vigorous exercise can make a huge difference in how they feel.
Yeah, even in the management of anxiety, I had a gentleman one time, he came to me and he would panic attacks, anxiety out of the blue. And as we were talking, it seemed he had been very much into running. And when he stopped, I don't think he made that connection, but the running was helping him to manage anxiety. And when he stopped, it just, just popped up. Then oxytocin, that's the love hormone, right? Socializing, including with grandmothers, physical touch, petting animals, and helping others.
Yeah.
I think I had done a podcast on healing with animals, and just amazing how incredibly good for the health having a pet is. And they really do love us with their whole hearts. It's pretty amazing. Then we get to serotonin, that's the mood stabilizers, sun exposure, mindfulness, nature walks. So there's so many resources that we could pull together, and it's all goes into the same goal, which is, this is a tough life. So anything we can harness to our benefit. I remember going one time to a conference, and the woman was a trauma survivor. And she was talking about what she does when she gets overwhelmed. And she said she takes sheets of paper, cuts them up, and on each little strip, she'll write something that is soothing to her. For example, taking a bubble bath, or reading a good book, or going to the movies, or taking a nature walk. And when she's overwhelmed, she puts all these in a jar, and she'll just pick one out. And it's a way of giving herself a gift in the middle of a stressful time. And so this is definitely something that we could all do, right? Absolutely. Of course, what my list might look different than your list. but we all have it. And it's important, I think, to not be so harsh with ourselves. Just getting back to the schemas, one of them relates to punitiveness and the belief that people should be harshly punished for making mistakes. But that relates to ourselves too, right? Not being tolerant of our own mistakes and how we process mistakes and what we tell ourselves.
Yes.
It definitely, people who are often angry, intolerant, disciplinary, or impatient, that leaves a bad feeling, obviously, when the opposite of tolerance and kindness and sympathy, we relate to chemicals, right? That their cortisol, the stress hormone, can very readily be dumped when we have negative input from the environment or even from ourselves.
That's true. Yes.
So, yeah, so I definitely, this article, I encouraged, the audience to look at it. It's really fascinating. It really helps to crystallize what our schemas are. I've actually done this with patients in my practice where I've read them and they recognize themselves right away. Everyone has their thing, whether it's feelings of failure or feelings of vulnerability, right? Always being afraid of the next major catastrophe. And that certainly leaves a feeling too, right? Versus someone, I always go back to my rule of thumb. I call it Linda's rule of thumb, which is like this: if and when it happens, you can worry about it, but not before. Because if you worry about it before, it's going to rob you of your joy and your happiness. You just got to have the belief in yourself that whatever arises, you'll be capable of dealing with it. But if you're operate from the feeling of vulnerability, like self-doubt of one's ability to handle the next major catastrophe, I've certainly seen this over and over again. Like I would work with one man, he was always expecting the other shoe to drop. The sad thing is, his little boy was picking up on the same outlook in life. What a disservice to that child.
Yeah.
And it goes from generation to generation, right? There are some families that are full of worry warts, and it starts with the mother or the grandmother. And there it does take a lot of diligence to spot the thinking, right? Police the thought, and then replace it with something different. In some cases, it takes a lot of input because we're talking about a lifetime of this type of orientation. It doesn't change overnight. But I think it has to do also with the willingness of the person, just seeing the disservice to this child who's picking up this fear-based approach to life. How limiting is that? So again, that anxiety and joy cannot coexist.
Absolutely. And if you're putting all your energy into those, into the fear, the anxiety, all of those emotions, you're lessening your ability to make good decisions as well, right? If you're in that fear place, the blood's not going to the part of your brain that makes good decisions.
Yeah. Or alternative way to see that, you mentioned too about raising the vibration, right?
Yeah, absolutely. The higher the emotion, the higher vibration of the emotion, the better you're going to feel. So trying to keep it, at least no lower than curiosity, maybe.
Mm-hmm.
If you can just be curious about what's going on instead of feeling bad about it, that can help a lot.
Yeah, I heard that as a strategy actually for overcoming depression. Whenever you're feeling down, try to learn something new or get curious about something, and it does work.
Yeah, yeah.
That thank goodness we have a whole world to learn from.
That's true. Yeah.
Um, well, thank you so much for the words of wisdom. Do you have any final words to conclude our podcast?
Just for people to understand that if they have patterns in their life that are not what they are happy about, that there are things they can do to change that. They are not just stuck that way. You know, if every time something goes wrong, you say, well, it's just the way I am, that's a clue that you've got beliefs there that are keeping you stuck in that place, and you can do something to change that.
Judy, thank you so much. Really appreciated having you today.
Thank you. I enjoyed the conversation. Okay.